So welcome again, Volodya, to American Enterprise Institute. Добро пожаловать.
It's great to be here. Thanks very much.
So I hope to speak today, to cover a lot of ground today. Obviously, what's Putin doing inside Russia and outside Russia? What do you and other pro-democracy activists are doing in turn to oppose him and try to build a democratic and free and prosperous Russia? Secondly, what can the United States do, especially given that we're in the midst of our primaries? And of course, we'll talk about Putin's foreign policy, why he's doing what he's doing, and where do you think he's going to stop, if ever. And finally, I hope to, given that you're a Cambridge-trained historian, to talk about the future of Russia and the future of the regime, something that you've written about a lot and thought about over the years, and of course have the first-hand knowledge now. I can't think of a single person who could give us as good and in-depth a picture of what's happening in Russia as you.
You're too kind, but I'll be happy to try.
I'm sure we'll succeed. So the first question is a personal one, actually, personal to you, but I think it encapsulates the nasty, probably bordering on bizarre atmosphere now inside Russia. Last week, the Chechen dictator, maybe soon a caliph, Ramzan Kadyrov, posted a surveillance-like video on his Instagram account where you and another opposition leader, Mikhail Kasyanov, former prime minister, look like being in crosshairs. Now, given that your friend and colleague Boris Nemtsov was killed last year, and given that you were nearly poisoned to death, or so it seems, that seems to be the consensus now, that you were deliberately poisoned. What do you think of this instance of harassment, but maybe give us a broader sense as well?
Well, given Mr. Kadyrov's background and reputation, both Mikhail Kasyanov and I consider this video to be a direct threat, to be direct and public incitement to murder, and in fact we have already submitted an official request for a criminal probe into this posting, this publication. In fact, in the last few weeks, we have seen a whole series of what seem to be coordinated attacks and threats issued by Mr. Kadyrov himself, as well as his close henchmen, against Kremlin opponents, against Russian opposition leaders. And in fact, just a few days ago, Mr. Kasyanov was physically attacked in Moscow by people who looked like Chechens, and in fact there were 3 serving members of the Russian Interior Ministry in Chechnya who were briefly detained after this. And frankly, I think this whole series of events is a direct result of the brazen impunity that has surrounded the assassination of our friend, my friend, Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, who was gunned down 200 yards away from the Kremlin nearly a year ago in February 2015. Despite the fact that traces of this crime evidently lead to Grozny, or at least through Grozny, absolutely, or at least through the capital of Chechnya, and despite the fact that those arrested on suspicion of murdering Boris were serving members of the Interior Ministry of the Russian Federation in Chechnya,
I would think.
Absolutely, despite the fact that Mr. Kadyrov publicly called the man accused of killing Boris Nemtsov to be, quote, a true patriot, end of quote, and despite the numerous requests by the lawyers representing Boris Nemtsov's children to question Mr. Kadyrov regarding this case, he wasn't questioned even formally by the investigators. We hear no criticism of him or his actions or his public threats from the Kremlin. In fact, we hear the opposite. We continue to hear laudatory statements from the top Russian leadership with regard to Mr. Kadyrov. Just a few days ago, Vladimir Putin publicly thanked Mr. Kadyrov for his effective work. This is a quote. And Kremlin Chief of Staff Sergei Ivanov said on the record that the Russian leadership has no questions for Mr. Kadyrov. Well, I think after such statements and after such words, there are no questions left for the Russian leadership itself. But on the substance of your question, yes, we know that it's a dangerous vocation to be in opposition to Vladimir Putin's regime. We have seen too many confirmations of that already. So we know the risks, we understand the risks, but frankly I think we, those who view the future of Russia differently from what the present regime does, we have no right to stand down or to give up or to run away because, it's our country and we have to fight for it.
Well, let's talk about this fight. Last fall, Russia held local elections. And your party, the Party of People's Freedom, or known also as Parnas, was the only one that was allowed to participate, and then only in one out of 85 Russian regions. I mean, clearly, as you gear up, and that's the essence of your work, as I understand it now in Russia, as you gear up for the national parliament, Duma elections, this coming
Yes.
September. Given this past record, and given the record of the past, God knows, 10, 15 years, where's the hope? Doesn't it all seem hopeless, and yet you continue your work?
Well, first of all, let's just get one thing clear. There hasn't been a free and fair election in Russia in at least 16 years. If we judge by the statements and evaluations of international monitors, namely from the OSCE and from the Council of Europe, the last election in Russia that corresponded at least partially to the to European standards of free and fair elections were held in March of 2000. So that's 16 years ago. Every election since then has been characterized by suppression of the opposition or outright disqualification of the opposition. As you mentioned, in these regional elections, for instance, last year, the People's Freedom Party was prevented from participating in the elections in Novosibirsk, in Kaluga, in Magadan, in Nizhny Novgorod. And this is the usual picture. You have to understand that, as a rule, genuine, real opposition to the Kremlin is not even allowed to formally participate in the election process, and we're taken off the ballot ahead of time. In those few instances when the opposition is allowed to be on the ballot, we score pretty good results, such as when Boris Nemtsov won his legislative seat in Yaroslavl in 2013, or when Alexei Navalny received, even according to the official results, nearly 30% of the vote in Moscow in the mayoral election in 2013. So basically elections in Putin's Russia have been turned into a meaningless ritual to formalize the regime and to continue its stay in power. However, we believe, and I believe, and this is also from historical experience, that boycotts and passive posture never work. And I think we have to use even this bogus and sham and watered down election process as it exists today in order to try to get our message across to as many of our compatriots as we can, and also to help young, up-and-coming political opposition, civil society activists to gain some political experience by participating in these campaigns, to gain some reputation, to gain name recognition. And this is precisely what we plan to do this year, this September, on September the 18th, when Russia will hold national parliamentary elections, or so-called elections, but nevertheless. So for instance, the Open Russia movement, of which I'm the national coordinator, has tried twice already last year, first on the municipal level in St. Petersburg and then on the regional level in Novosibirsk, to support candidates. And both times, candidates whom were supported, even again according to the official results, came in second place with more than 20% of the vote. This is a really far cry from the 1.5% or 2% for the opposition that the Kremlin would like people to believe. So this year we're preparing to support 10, 15, maybe 20 candidates for the State Duma in single-member districts across Russia, mostly in big cities, of course, but still across Russia. We're not talking about just Moscow. In order, again, to get our message across, this pro-democracy, pro-European alternative message to what the Kremlin is offering to as many people as we can, and to help our supporters, young opposition and civil society activists, to gain this experience, because nothing is forever, and this regime is not forever, and there will come a time when a new generation of pro-democracy Russians will have to take responsibility for the country, and we want to start getting them ready for that today.
Excellent. We will talk about Russia's future very soon. But let me go back to, as announced, to foreign policy. Now, the word that's most commonly used, in fact, we could count the number of times when this word was used or has been used by the Obama administration, high officials, State Department, White House spokesman, in reaction to Putin's foreign policy. And that word is surprise. They're constantly surprised. I mean, literally, they're surprised. I could say, some of them are saying, Mr. Putin is, I'm quoting the spokesman for the White House, Mr. Putin's intentions are hard to discern, or this is my favorite, we're dying to know what Mr. Putin is doing. Are you surprised by what he's doing? And if not, why not?
Well, frankly, speaking for me personally, I understood everything they needed to be understood about Mr. Putin on, I even remember the date. It was the 20th of December, 1999, when he was still prime minister, 11 days from being acting president. On that day, this was the day of the Chekist, the day of the KGB or NKVD.
Uh-huh.
On that day, he did three things. He opened a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov on Lubyanka Square on the KGB building.
Right, the former head of the KGB. Of course,
the notorious head of the KGB who was instrumental in a campaign against dissenters who invented this punitive psychiatry and actively promoted it and so forth. On the same day, he spoke at a big gathering of KGB veterans, and he told them that a group of KGB employees that has been sent undercover into the Russian government has fulfilled their mission. Everybody thought it was a joke at the time, but he wasn't joking. And the third thing he did on the same day was to raise a glass to Joseph Stalin, because this is also Stalin's birthday, the 20th of December, when he was meeting party leaders in the Moscow White House. Mm-hmm. So for me, there was everything that needed to be understood about Mr. Putin, I understood on that day. Other people understood it even much earlier, so I can't claim to be an oracle or anything like that on this. But I think everything he's now doing in terms of aggression outside of the Russian borders, in terms of his foreign policy, is a direct consequences of what he's been doing domestically since the very first days after he came to power. There is no reason, in my mind, to expect a regime that tramples on the rights of its own citizens and that disregards its own constitution to, for some reason, respect the rights of its neighboring countries and to respect international law. There's no reason to expect that. I think one comes directly from another. And many of us in the Russian opposition have said this for a long time. Unfortunately, not a lot of people among Western elites chose to hear it. And I think, frankly, if the leaders of Western democracies had taken a firmer and more principled stand against the Putin regime earlier on, we would not be seeing the excesses we're seeing today. But we are where we are, and better late than never. And I hope that at least now, the leaders of the democratic nations of the West know who is Mr. Putin, that famous question that was posed in Davos 16 years ago now. Just think about that number. It's almost a full generation has passed in Russia since Mr. Putin came to power. He's now been in power almost as long as Brezhnev has, just 2 years away from that number.
Yeah, he's about to start competing with Stalin. If you count Stalin, single-man dictatorship, full dictatorship since about 1929, mm-hmm.
Then
to 53, that's 24 years.
Yes.
So he's within a striking distance.
I'm certain it's not going to get to that, but it's certainly coming close, you're right.
Just to close up on this, Syria, everybody's concerned about Syria. Again, every time Russia does something, every time they bring more troops, every time they establish yet another base, this time within a stone's throw from Turkish border, a NATO member, the official Washington is surprised. Surprised. What's the end game there in Syria?
Well, I think as with all the foreign policy adventures of this Kremlin regime, the origins are domestic, and they're found inside. And once eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, became a quagmire for the regime, once Ukraine proved a too difficult target and the so-called Novorossiya project clearly failed, the Kremlin's propaganda machine needed new ammunition, a new fodder to revive rather the faded strongman image, to show another round of television pictures purporting to be a great power, to be sending troops halfway across the world in an instant, to be an equal on the world stage, if you will. And this is when Syria came in. And if you look at the Kremlin-controlled television channels in Russia, which is of course all the major television channels in Russia today, you will see that Syria has replaced Ukraine as the main subject. Whereas before they used to show all the time the Donbass and the fight against the so-called fascist and Banderovites in the Donbass, now they're showing Syria and the so-called fight against terrorism that Putin's Air Force is conducting in Syria. Now there's of course an additional very important reason, I think, that the Kremlin is doing this. The informal club of dictators is a pretty loyal one. And Mr. Putin doesn't like to see a fellow despot fall from power. He's already seen too many in his time, from Gaddafi to Yanukovych. And I think an additional goal in this is to help preserve Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. And of course it's evident now to everybody that the chief targets of the Russian Air Force in Syria are not in fact ISIS strongholds, but are the anti-Assad opposition forces.
Well, back to the United States, the presidential primaries are underway, and unlike Russians, we don't know who will be the president. Now, what would be your advice to the presidential hopefuls?
Well, I think first of all it's important to state that it is our job and our task to bring political changes in Russia, to bring a democratic future for Russia. This is a task for us, the Russian opposition, not for anybody from the outside. But I think the best thing the US government and the future US president, whoever he or she might be, can do with regard to Russia is frankly to stand on the position of principle and to make sure that the relationship with the Kremlin and with Russia is informed above all by the values, the fundamental values that form the basis of what the United States is all about. There's unfortunately too often been two extremes in the way the US government deals with Russia and the Kremlin. One extreme has been to blame the entire Russian nation and Russia as a country for the actions of the unelected regime that we have now. And the other extreme is to befriend the Kremlin dictator and to pretend that Putin is a fully fledged friend and partner. Unfortunately, we've seen White Houses of both parties fall into this trap in recent years. So I think it's very important on the one hand to distinguish clearly and publicly between Russia on the one hand and the Kremlin regime on the other hand, to recognize that Russia today is ruled by an unaccountable, unelected, authoritarian regime, to maintain lines of communications with Russian society and with pro-democracy forces inside Russian society, and to make it clear, and this is very important, that a future democratic Russia will have its rightful place at the table in the future world. That is a very important issue. But on the other hand, when we're talking about relationship with the current regime, with Mr. Putin's regime in the Kremlin, I think it's very important to approach them from a position of principle and from a position of strength. Because a very important thing to understand about the current regime is that it does not consider compromise and accommodation as an invitation to reciprocate. It considers them as a sign of weakness, and it becomes more aggressive and more brazen. And again, we already talked about how they have become more aggressive against Western inaction and Western refusal to recognize the reality in many cases. And I think the most important thing is to practice what you preach and to practice the principles that you preach. And I'd like to mention one thing in particular. A little more than 3 years ago, the US Congress passed the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. In my view, one of the most principled pieces of legislation ever passed in any parliament in the world. This law, as you know, is designed to end the impunity for those Kremlin officials and Kremlin-connected oligarchs who continue to abuse the rights of Russian citizens and to plunder resources of Russian taxpayers by denying them the privilege, and it is a privilege, not a right, of traveling to and keeping their assets in the United States. This is a very pro-Russian law. It's seen as a pro-Russian law by Russian citizens, and there have been numerous opinion polls to this effect. Despite the Kremlin propaganda, the Kremlin hasn't managed to present it as, quote, sanctions against Russia, because the Russian people understand that these are targeted individual personal sanctions against those who abuse their rights and steal their money. But frankly, in the more than 3 years since this law has come into effect, implementation has been very timid. And we have seen only low-level abusers targeted so far. And I think it's important to not have any glass ceilings with regard to this law, and to include prominent human rights abusers as well as low-level targets. However many differences, however many similarities there are between the current regime in the Kremlin and the Soviet regime, and there are many similarities. We have political prisoners, we have media censorship, we have elections without choice, as it were, and many, many other things that are similar. There is one major difference, and that is that while they put dissenters in prison, and while they ruled through repression and coercion, the likes of Brezhnev, Suslov, and Andropov did not keep their bank accounts in the West. They did not buy properties and yachts in the West. They did not send their kids to study in the West. People from the current regime like to do all that. They like to rule inside Russia in the manner of a third world dictatorship, but they like to use all the privileges that the Western democratic world has to offer for themselves. Now, I think this double standard must end, and the best way for a future US president, whoever he or she might be, to show solidarity with those people in Russia who strive for a democratic future is to end this double standard and to make sure this law is implemented to its full extent.
Let's talk about Russian future. Again, you're a Cambridge-trained historian, and you wear, among many hats that you wear, I've always enjoyed your analytical articles, and I've always enjoyed your work on Russian history, and I'll mention one of them in a moment. The future of Russia and the future of the regime. Fortunately, they're not synonymous, and you're absolutely correct about this. So let's start with something that has almost become a cliche. But, like any cliche, I think it has a great deal of truth to it, which is that there has been an implicit social contract. After the turmoil and the revolution and the usual dislocation caused by great revolutions, the institutions that were put and planted in the 1990s, which are described as horrible times and times of lawlessness and especially corruption, that's particularly funny. The growth started, and of course this regime benefited hugely. And the idea was that the people who were first impoverished by the Soviet regime and then gone through the traditional, normal, unfortunately, dislocations of a great revolution, the regime offered a bargain. You stay out of politics, and we see to it that your incomes grow, there is stability, and there's certain semblance of at least personal security. And because at the beginning of Putin's rule, oil was $18 a barrel, and then it went all the way to $140 a barrel, almost steadily, with some hiccups. Pretty much that contract has been implemented. Now, this contract appears to be under threat now. The economy contracted by 4%. It is likely to contract 1, 2, 3, 4% if the oil stays at this level. More importantly, as Putin's own advisors, including his top advisor, Alexei Kudrin, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, said on numerous occasions, many times, Russia hit an institutional wall. The institutions are so disfigured and so hostile to the investment climate that even if, and that's Kudrin's opinion, even if oil is back to $100 a barrel, there is really no substantial growth to Russia, unless oil, as he put it, grows $10, $14 a barrel every year, which is very unlikely. So let's start with this contract between the people and the regime. It's under threat. So could you describe what might be the? Oh, and I also should mention that the inflation, of course, is 13-14%. Real incomes for the first time since Putin's been in power, as you mentioned, 16 years, are down by about 9%. And of course, Putin imposed sanctions on the imports in a country where, because of the regime's economic strategy, has become essentially has instituted a bargain whereby it sells oil and buys pretty much everything else with the petrodollars. These sanctions on food and, even more importantly, for example, on medicine, are hurting a lot of people. And the government is also slashing education. They're slashing funds for medical care. Social mobility is virtually stopped. We know all those things. I don't want to go down the list. So let's first discuss, what do you think the reaction of the people will be? And also, what do you think the regime will do to survive?
Well, I think two things are certain. First of all, that there was indeed such an implicit social contract, as you mentioned. And secondly, that it is under severe threat. And the Kremlin is increasingly struggling to fulfill its end of that social conflict. The situation, the economic situation in our country today is indeed in free fall.
Tell us what you see when you travel, especially in provinces. I understand the situation is getting to be quite dire.
Sure. Well, even if we look at all the major indicators, even at the surface, we'll see a double-digit inflation. We'll see a massive devaluation of the national currency, more than 100% since 2014.
Correct.
We're seeing a decline in the GDP. We're seeing a decline and fall in real incomes to the level of more than a decade ago. And sure, this is caused to a major extent by falling oil prices, but here it also has to be mentioned that during his rule, Putin has actually increased the dependence of the Russian economy on oil prices. Oil and gas accounted for 40% of Russian exports when Putin came to power. Today it accounts for 70% of Russian exports. And also it's the actions of the regime, such as the so-called counter-sanctions that you mentioned also, that hit Russian consumers much harder than they did the intended recipients, but also the sanctions themselves that have been caused by flagrant violations of international law, which was also what the Kremlin regime did. Nobody forced them to do it. It was their choice to do it, and these are the consequences. So we're seeing a major, obviously, deterioration of the economy. And also, for example, going back to the oil prices, today it's about $30 a barrel, and we're seeing 4 to 5% decline in GDP. When Mikhail Kasyanov, for instance, was prime minister, the oil price was about $20 to $25 a barrel, and we saw 7 to 8% growth every year. So it's not just, we can't blame everything, or the Kremlin rather, cannot blame everything on just oil prices. It's also the mismanagement, it's also the destructions of institutions, it's also the enormous level of corruption, official corruption, that I think it's safe to say is now at the highest level it's ever been in Russian history.
I apologize, Volodya. I'll let you continue, but I can't. I just remembered something. I was on a panel with Boris Nemtsov on the 80th anniversary of Boris Yeltsin's.
5 years ago.
5 years ago. And of course, you know, there was a very special relationship between the two. He essentially, first of all, they're both Borises. And secondly, my sense is from you know, what I read as I wrote my biography of Yeltsin, and also from what I heard from Boris Nemtsov, among others, Yeltsin really treated him as a son that he never had.
And he groomed him as a successor.
And groomed him as a successor, that's correct. So we were on the same panel together, and Boris, as always, was extremely funny and lighthearted about the things. And one of the things he mentioned, and that I want to say it now because of something that you said, he said, during most of Yeltsin's rule, the price of oil on average was $18 a barrel. How many days will Vladimir Putin survive as a ruler, as the ruler of Russia, if oil were $18 a barrel? And then he said something that was very typical of him. He said he would be carried on pitchforks on the third day out of his Kremlin's office. I just thought I would remember Boris, and I thought it was a fairly realistic assessment.
Sure, and of course, Boris also always reminded that in the summer of '98, during the financial crisis, the price of oil was, I believe, was between $6 and $9 a barrel. And again, today, that government could only dream of the level that Putin currently has, 30. And we see all the problems and all the crises that that are happening before our eyes in Russia today under the management, or mismanagement, I should say, of Putin's regime. So it's certain, I think, that the Kremlin is increasingly struggling to fulfill its part of the social contract, so in economic terms. So in order to maintain its grip on power, they're increasingly turning to repression and to a relentless propaganda, finding the external enemies, rallying up against them, all these usual things,
right.
all these usual tricks that are not new.
Right.
And we as historians, we both saw many examples of this in history. But we also saw that these tricks and these attempts to hold on to power usually end the same way. And I think a very good parallel would be what happened in our own country, in Russia, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when, as you remember, the political control of the communist establishment remained in place, the propaganda machine over television remained in place, but it simply became less and less and less effective as the economic reality increasingly diverged from the propaganda image. This is the proverbial battle between the television set and the fridge. And the fridge always wins, certainly in Russia, it always wins. And I think however much the current regime will try to cling to its power, again by finding enemies, by rallying up its propaganda machine, by increasing repression and tightening the screws, as it were, I think the end result will be the same. Unfortunately, and this is a very big problem, and the Kremlin likes to accuse us, members of the Russian opposition, of being revolutionaries and preparing for a Russian Maidan. And of course, I would say that the biggest revolutionaries of all are people in the Kremlin itself today, because they're the ones who destroyed all the institutions of state, who turned elections into a meaningless farce, who turned parliament into not a place for discussion, as they themselves famously said, who turned all the major media outlets into weapons of its propaganda machine, and thus destroyed and eliminated every single legal and constitutional way of changing the government. And in doing so, they ensure that whenever change does come to Russia, political change, and nothing is forever, and nothing is permanent, that this change will take the shape of some kind of a revolutionary process. It's the Kremlin themselves, it's Vladimir Putin himself, who ensure that this will be the case. And I'm not saying it with any pleasure, because as a historian, as you said, which I am, I don't think that revolutions are necessarily a force for good, especially in our own Russian history. But this is what the Kremlin's actions are leading to, that whenever change does come to our country, and again, it will come, nothing is forever, it will come in some kind of a revolutionary form.
This is a good way to, an excellent way, I should say, to lead to the next topic of our discussion, which is the future of Russia, in a broader sense. Vladimir, I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that because of this relentless assault on what we consider normal civilized values, human rights, human dignity, freedom of the press, honest courts, and so on and so forth, the regime has managed to create probably the most cynical society in Russian history, the most cynical and the most corrupt, which, again, as historians, it's a hard first to take, as they would say in Cambridge. There's a great deal of competition in Russian history. But again, I'm throwing that in to see what you think. But as you mentioned, and again, the public opinion polls are all showing us, and I'm drawing here on a very recent annual conference of the Levada Center, which is perhaps the only reliable public opinion polling, independent public opinion polling firm in Russia. And our colleague and friend Lev Gutkov, who is the chairman, said that there's been the steady discreditation of the values of democracy, human rights, and lawful state. And the result was what might be called the morally scorched earth. In other words, the chilling picture of Russia that we saw, for example, in this brilliant movie, Leviathan, which was nominated and should have gotten an Oscar for the best foreign film, whereby so long as you pay the next level, or you contribute to the next level, essentially the coterie of the procurator, the mayor, the chief of police, and the judge could pretty much do whatever they want in their own locale. Now, how is it that, given that this has been going on for so long, how is it that you hope that you could draw on some sort of social capital? And let's not forget the immigration of the best and the brightest. The numbers are staggering. 200,000 in the last few years, according to the official data. And it's just, the entrepreneurs, the people who would have invented things for Russia, the people who would have opened new businesses for Russia and created workplaces and jobs, and simply the people who would have, enriched the Russian culture. All of that has been draining hugely, not to mention, the flight of the investment capital. And yet you continue to believe that you could draw on something to create the Russia that we talked about, free and prosperous. Could you explain why you remain hopeful?
Well, Vladimir Bukovsky, who's a legendary figure, as you know, in the Russian human rights
the Soviet
movement.
dissident.
Yes, and to this day, in fact.
Right.
He once said a phrase that I always like to remember. He said that one of the most surprising things about Russia is that at any time, despite everything, whatever happens, there are always people in Russia who are prepared to stand up to the lies, to the injustice, to the repression, and defend the honor and the dignity. And if we look at the Soviet period, millions of people were killed in the Gulag system. Millions more were broken in the same system of prisons and labor camps. Yet millions more emigrated, left the country. And yet, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Russian society found the strength in itself still to stand up for and defend its newly found freedom and to prevent a return to totalitarianism. And I think that's a very important lesson. And it's absolutely true, and it's pointless to argue with it, that Putin's rule in the last 16 years has been maintained not just by economic giveaways, not just by coercion, but also by a relentless propaganda that's been fostering and emphasizing, imperial complexes, mistrust, aggression, finding so-called external enemies.
And internal.
Dividing, yes, exactly, and internal, and dividing people into us versus them, and so on and so forth. And this will be, I think, a horrible legacy of the Putin regime, and it will be one of the most formidable tasks, in my view, of a future post-Putin government in Russia, to try to undo the damage done by this propaganda to the fabric of Russian society. But, just as always, just as before, there are many people in Russia today, millions of them, who see a different future for our country, a future based on the rule of law, based on political freedoms, based on the dignity of the human being, based on European, what we call modern European values. There are millions of them. I see them and I meet them as I travel around our country and into different regions of Russia. They are not being heard under the current regime. They have no political representation. They have no political voice. It's designed to be that way under the present regime. But these people are there. They exist. And in my view, they offer the best hope for Russia's future development.
Volodya, again, you touched on this here and there, but for better or worse, the impression that we get from the U.S. media, or the people who would watch this, is that it's a dictatorship, it's an authoritarian regime, it's a brutal authoritarian regime. There is nothing that you can do. And in fact, I found that in one case, or actually in a couple of cases, where I was writing for elite American publications, and I used the word opposition, and the editor turned it into dissidents. Because I was explained, opposition is when there is democracy, and dissidence is in the regimes like the Soviet Union. So if you could draw a little bit, explain that, and of course, given that, it pains me to say it, but given that you were nearly killed last May, clearly you believe and you hope in what you're doing. You would not be doing it otherwise. So could you explain to us what is the state of the Russian opposition? What are the venues even available to it? And secondly, why are you pursuing this road?
Well, I think it's a very important distinction that you made between opposition and the dissident movement. And in fact, Boris Nemtsov said not a long time before his death, before he was killed, that he no longer considers himself an opposition leader but a dissident leader because precisely what you said, the opposition usually sits in parliament. In Russia, the opposition sits in prisons or more and more often, unfortunately, in the cemeteries, and that is a fact of life. But I think what keeps us going is a very simple fact, and I can speak certainly for myself, and I'm sure for many of my friends and colleagues. Russia is my country. I believe in it. I believe in its future. And I think the current regime is driving it into a dead end, politically, economically, in terms of the state of society, in terms of relations with the outside world. And I know there are millions of my compatriots, millions of people in Russia, even today, even despite everything that's happening, who also believe in a different future for Russia, in a future based on respect for dignity and human rights, in democracy, in the rule of law, in political freedom, in good relations with our neighbors and the outside world at large. And these people have no political voice, they have no political representation, but I think they offer the best hope for the future development of Russia, and we have to do all we can to give them this political voice and to support them and to present this alternative, to present this different vision for our country's development. Sure, it's a very dangerous vocation to be in opposition to Putin's regime, and we've seen many confirmation of this. Soviet dissidents used to have this phrase, "the night is darkest before the dawn." And this past year has been, I think, especially dark, with the assassination of Boris, with what happened to me, the attempted murder, and with many more jailings and many more cases of repression against those who disagree with the Kremlin, and many more threats that continue to be issued. So it has been a very dark year. But I believe that the night is darkest before the dawn. And I still believe that the values of freedom and justice will prevail in Russia. I believe that that day will come. And I believe that it is our moral duty and my moral duty to do everything we can to bring that day just a little bit closer.
In practical terms, as I mentioned to you before we started, I see your name popping up in various interviews, and one of them talked about Open Russia, the organization that you represent, extending its offers of expertise and funding. Could you give us an insight of how do you do it, how does that happen, and what hope there is for this?
Sure. Well, we know perfectly well that elections in Putin's Russia are not real elections, that they just serve as a ritual held once every 5 or 6 years, depending on parliament or president, to formalize the regime's hold on power. The opposition is, in most cases, not allowed to contest the elections, or in the rare cases when it is suppressed, and the vast administrative resources are used against it. However, we believe that boycotts do not work. We believe that we can use even this watered down and sham electoral process as exists today in order to try to get our message across, our message based on democracy and rule of law and European values to as many people as we can. And also, as importantly, I think, to help those opposition candidates, especially young political activists, to gain some political experience by participating in these campaigns, to gain some name recognition, to gain some reputation for themselves. And this is why we, the Open Russia movement, are planning to support 15 to 20 candidates for the State Duma, for the lower house of the Russian parliament, in the upcoming Duma election, or so-called election, by offering them, as you said, informational, legal, PR support, infrastructural support for their campaigns, by making our experts and our specialists available for them to help them gain this experience and gain their name in this fight. And this is what we'll be doing. And we've tried already, in fact, last year in 2015, in 2 different cases. One was the municipal election in St. Petersburg, and the other one was a regional election in Novosibirsk. We had in both cases a candidate whom Open Russia was backing, and in both cases our candidate came in second with even officially more than 20% of the vote. And so another important goal is to show that, you know, however much the Kremlin likes to pretend that the democratic opposition has 1 or 2% support in Russia, this is simply not true, even in the current repressive conditions. And I'm hopeful that we're going to show this again, this time on a national level, in September of this year during the State Duma elections. And of course, there will also come a day, and I think personally that it's not going to be that long away, when there'll be a real election in Russia. I think we have to start preparing for it now, and to start getting the people ready and prepared for it, and start helping people gain this experience that they will use when a real election comes. And this is what we're going to be doing starting this year.
Well, thank you very much, Volodya. This is a good note to end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Happy to do this.